morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be here to Språkkraft and Lingvis. My name is Louise Fabricius, and I'm a senior analyst at Oxford Research, which is a quite small consultancy firm that does analysis and evaluations for the public sector, located in more or less all the Nordic countries. We work with a range of different questions, but the study that I'm here to present to you today is one that we have been completing throughout the past year for the Nordic Council of Ministers on language training for adult immigrants in the Nordic countries. And we started off the study back in January, and I know that some of you here have also participated in it, which we appreciate greatly. The report is forthcoming, so it'll be published in January. So unfortunately, I can't share the final report with you today, but it's on its way. Okay. Figuring out the clicker here. Right, so the purpose of our study has been to increase the knowledge of language learning among adult immigrants in the Nordic countries, and we focus specifically on Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden. So Iceland hasn't been included in this study. To give insights into the quality of this. So basically, we haven't done a mapping of everything that's available. That's already been done. There are some really extensive, really well worked through reports doing that. So while we have a little information, publicly available quantitative data. And then we've done some case studies on formal and non-formal language training services that we have found to be successful according to some different criteria. And I know that some of you here today have contributed to that as well. The key terminology that we have used is a little bit different than I think what will be spoken of here today. And we've done that to make it clearer in terms of exactly what we're speaking about. So for us, formal language training services are the language training services which are usually a part of, for example, an integration program. They're mandatory. There's a set curriculum, typically at national level. There may be public exams, formalized exams. It's regulated in terms of who's allowed to deliver it, and so on, and also can often be a requirement to stay in the country. Non-formal language training services is everything else. So we've made a distinction between what we call non-formal language training services delivered by commercial providers. So for example, shorter language courses that are not within these integration programs, but they can be short, they can be targeted, and so on. And then the volunteer-run services, which often have a social aspect as well. And in these non-formal services, we also include things like digital services, such as, well, Duolingo and other examples. Then when it comes to another pertinent terminology here is subgroups of immigrants. Now, these are based on who is allowed or who is eligible for language training in Norway. So there's a distinction between refugees and their family members, and immigrants who arrive through family reunification with Nordic citizens, labour migrants from inside the EU EEA and also from outside the EU EEA. And as I'll be showing, then this distinction does not really apply in the same way in the other countries, especially when it comes to eligibility. But because the study has also been funded by the Norwegian Ministry for Work and Inclusion, then we've sort of used those criteria to start with. Now, first, a sort of brief comparison of the systems for language training. Basically, our findings are that, and maybe a little bit surprisingly, they're actually really similar. Language training in all the Nordic countries is a key element of integration policies. It's something that's prioritized, it's something that's very widely accepted, as this is necessary for integration for all immigrants. Realizing that we're quite small countries, you can get quite far with English, but you'll never get all the way. Yeah, and secondly, services, and now we're talking about both formal and non-formal services. Though to a large extent, they're publicly funded. Formal services, of course, often run by public actors or else by the private actors that have been procured. Private actors procured by public authorities. But also for non-formal services, public funding is actually a very important revenue stream, along with donations and volunteer hours, and in some countries, foundations, for example. Also, largely, the main long-term goal of formal language training services, and also non-formal, is to facilitate labour market and social integration. And for non-formal services, especially those that we could say are volunteer-led, those are often more to the social side, but ultimately, labour market integration, becoming an integrated part of society, is a long-term goal in language training, of course. The few differences that we do see, or large differences that we see between countries in terms of formal services, is eligibility, who is allowed to participate. Whereas when it comes to non-formal services, there are so many and they're enacted in such different ways that we can't really compare them at country level. Instead, the comparison that we make there has to be between the services themselves. But basically, all kinds of services are available in all countries, and it is something that is quite prioritized. So just a quick overview of formal services and how they differ between countries. When it comes to the importance of private providers providing public formal language training services, this is particularly important for Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. For Finland, all actors who provide these types of language training within the integration program are procured private services. Public actors aren't allowed to provide these. In Denmark, it's quite a large fraction. I think it's over 70% that are private providers, and in Sweden it's about half. In Norway, there are some private providers, but they're actually not that extensive, and they're not at all as important players. Then when it comes to eligibility, the really big difference here. In Denmark and Sweden, all immigrants, regardless of their background, how they have arrived in the Nordic country as refugees, labour market migrants, as well, they are eligible to participate in formal language training services. This is not the case in Finland and in Norway. In Finland, any immigrants who are not employed are eligible to participate. Whereas in Norway, there are some quite fine distinctions between whether you have arrived as a refugee, you're allowed, or a family member of refugees, you participate free of charge. As a labour migrant from outside the EU or EES, you need to participate, but you must pay for it yourself. And if you come from the EU or EEA, then you're not eligible to participate in formal training. And there are some reasons behind this that I won't go into now, so that's quite a large distinction from the other countries. There's also a distinction in terms of whether training is completed within a set time frame. And this can vary quite a lot between the different countries and integration plans. But basically the only country which doesn't have a set time frame need to complete your formal training is Sweden, where there is more, as when you have an adequate level of language training, that's when you, or of the language, that's when you kind of aren't eligible anymore. Both Sweden and Norway also have a goals on the CEFR scale in terms of what immigrants need to accomplish to complete their training. And the countries also differ in terms of what funding is based on. So in all countries except Norway, these private providers, you'll get your funding based on how many migrants actually complete training, instead of, for example, how many hours of teaching they provide. When it comes to teaching qualifications, they're required legally to deliver training in Denmark and Norway. A certain number of ECTS points in teaching one of the languages as a foreign language are required by the teachers. This is not the case in Sweden, where this is required to grade the students, but not to actually teach. And in Finland, it's not a legal requirement at all. But since all language training is procured, it's often, or I would say always, as far as we know, it's one of the requirements in the procurement process. So that's the way that they secure teaching qualifications. And then finally, we see that in all countries, there is a close labour market collaboration when it comes to the formal language services. So, how do different stakeholders, and we focused on 3 different stakeholders here. We focused on the providers, the participants, and, the employers. How do they perceive the benefits and goals of language training? So, first of all, and this model is one that we showed in a slightly simplified version at the conference back in May, and that we've developed through all our data collection through the last couple of months. But basically, what we're seeing is that the goals and the motivating factors coupled with obstacles, they determine what are the main quality factors that of course lead to successful results in language training. So what are the goals and motivating factors? Employment and further education, labour market integration, and this cannot be highlighted enough, and this is by all actors that we've spoken to, and particularly the participants. They want to integrate. But it's not just about getting work or starting further education, it's also about being able to perform your work tasks safely. It's about communicating with colleagues. It's also about decreasing the risk of exploitation among workers, that they understand what are their rights, that they can communicate. It's also about social integration, understanding Nordic society and culture, and breaking social isolation, which can often be the case, particularly for refugees. Obstacles then, we've divided into external factors and cognitive barriers. External factors, things such as limited time, which is particularly prevalent, of course, among labour market migrants who are already working, have family lives, and so of course these are adults we're talking about, who already have a lot in their lives apart from training. There are also things like financial constraints. Of course, this can be particularly prevalent in Norway, as Beth was talking about. Formal language training, if you're not eligible for the free formal language training, can be quite expensive. But also for others, refugees, in terms of course, literature and being able to afford that. Travel distance also can also be a factor, and a lack of social network. Who do you practice speaking with? If you live in a segregated area, or if you are in an expat community where you mostly speak English, how do you actually get to practice this new language? And then when it comes to cognitive barriers, it can be things like educational background. The higher level of education, the more likely you are to be able to learn, but also ability to learn based on things like how many languages you already speak, how used to learning new languages are you? And based on this, what are the quality factors? On a more sort of regulative or organizational side, we've seen things like the models of compensation and procurement have to emphasize quality rather than costs. Teaching skills and qualifications also enable or increase the chance of delivering high quality language training, and using didactic methods adapted to participating needs. And what we mean by that is, for example, authentic learning that relates to daily lives of the people who are learning the language. Small learning groups and learning groups with similar educational backgrounds, that learning is meaningful and relevant to what they need. But also things like non-formal language training complementing formal training and how it's organized, either in a more physical sense, including having a language cafe as part of a language school, for example, as we've seen in one of our case studies, or including digital tools in the more formal learning, but also close collaboration with labour market that really enhances the relevance. And this applies to all countries. And finally, then, successful results, achieving the proficiency goals for language learning, employment, and of course, social integration and participation in society. Now, this is just a quick overview. The next slide, please. We found that the Nordic countries have achieved these identified quality factors to varying extents. Basically, there's a little bit of disagreement in terms of compensation models, where we say that compensation models and procurement systems affect quality in a positive way. That seems to be the case for Finland and Norway, to a lesser extent for Sweden and Denmark, although there are quite a lot of discussions in Denmark, and it really depends on their perspectives, where providers themselves find that procurement processes can be quite, that they don't necessarily enhance quality, whereas the authorities argue the other way. When it comes to teacher qualifications and skills, that seems primarily to be an issue in Sweden. In terms of learning groups having similar educational backgrounds and being small enough to facilitate learning, that also seems to be some differences between countries there. Meaningfulness is difficult to gauge on a national level, of course, but we have seen this in all countries. When it comes to things like non-formal services, filling the gaps in formal services, we find that this is particularly efficient in Denmark, Sweden, and Denmark, Finland, and Norway. Whereas in Sweden, maybe to a lesser extent, and this has more to do with the fact that the Swedish system is, the level of quality differs a lot depending on where you are. So there's a very uneven quality across the country and between providers. And where there might be an expectation that the non-formal services can fill this, providers themselves say that no, actually quality needs to be enhanced in the formal services. But we also see that there's close collaboration with the labour market in all countries, for example, through different kinds of education or courses that combine training and skills and language. So finally, our conclusions and suggestions for how could this be organized. Our main findings, very, very overall here. Formal language training is largely delivered according to participants' prerequisites and needs, is what we found here. That's a very broad conclusion, and of course there are a lot of things you can't go into detail with here. But going very, very largely, the fact that it is provided, in general, it actually enables those who are motivated to learn to achieve a certain level of language. But of course, regulatory and organizational factors very much affect the quality of delivered training, as do eligibility and accessibility. So whereas eligibility is actually being able to or being allowed to participate, accessibility is also having language training at times that it works for you. So maybe evenings, weekends, if you're working full time, and that it's not too far away, that if you are a parent and you also have young children at home, that there is childcare available where you're learning your language. All those are factors, for example, that affect accessibility. But also that non-formal language training services provide a very important complement to the formal services for all immigrant subgroups. Based on this, we've identified 7 criteria for best practice. So first of all, that it's widely available to immigrants regardless of the reason for being in the country. That it's meaningful based on didactic methods that work and provided by competent teachers or volunteers. Number 3, that funding is available and organized in a way that incentivizes quality. Number 4, that it provides ample opportunity to practice the language in real life settings and also to meet native speakers. Number 5, that it's accessible even when participants have limited time. Number 6, that it provides supportive and fun environments where participants feel comfortable challenging themselves and, as Jonas was saying earlier, making mistakes. That's how you learn. And number 7, that it involves employers and is relevant to the labour market. So finally, some broad suggestions on how to organise language training moving forward. Number 1, ensuring inclusivity for formal training for all immigrants. Particularly important for Finland and Norway, but also to some extent Denmark, where after 5 years, immigrants who have aren't eligible to participate anymore. Number 2, for all countries, is to structure the synergies between formal language training and non-formal digital services. What services are available to increase awareness, make databases? What are all these tools? There are so many tools out there. But to increase awareness among teachers, how can this be used? Number 3, increase the awareness and prestige of working with language training, particularly important in Sweden, but also to some extent in both Denmark and Finland, where there is a struggle in finding language teachers. Number 4 is to increase the structured collaboration between formal and non-formal language training services. And here we mean more in practice, in physical settings. And number 5, to continue to strengthen the role of the labour market and employers, ensuring the relevance of training. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. If you take a question or two, either from the Zoom or from the audience, and if you repeat the question in the mic, I think it's the best. Can you also speak that into the microphone? Yeah, can you open for questions?
Yes, open for questions.
Don't be shy.
Yes.
I was wondering, because in your presentation, you mentioned educational background as something that might have an impact. And I was wondering whether you have found any differences already, whether there is a difference between the language training for low literacy learners and more highly educated language learners.
Yes, I mean, what we found from statistics in all Nordic countries is that the higher level of education you have, the better results you get in your final exams. Then there are some results which can seem a little bit confusing in terms of when you look at pass levels, and particularly for a country like Sweden. But there's a dropout rate of 50% in Swedish SFI, as it's called. And so we think that could probably be because people who wouldn't have passed the courses, they drop out instead. But yes, there is in all countries, we found like a quantitative proven link between levels of education and those. It's not huge though. And that's also to do with the fact that formal training is available. I mean, in all countries, the immigrants will be placed in different tracks depending on their educational background. So someone who has a university education won't be in the same learning classes as someone who has primary school. So that differs, of course, in terms of balance.
I'm just testing it to see if this microphone makes it into the Zoom. No.
But let's try it anyway.
Let's speak out loud here
Yes.
instead. Yeah, okay.
Then I
Yeah, you don't need
use
it.
the mic.
We have microphones in the ceilings and picking, that's picking your phone.
Okay.
But let's speak out loud, so we can hear you on Zoom.
Thank you so much for the study. I think it's really interesting that, I mean, a lot of the stuff you say about the quality and what determines quality in language teaching, I think it confirms a lot of the things that we know already from research, which is always nice. But I think the strength of the study that you're presenting is the sort of the scope across the countries, which is really interesting and important. And that makes me wonder about sort of the methodological scope. So could you say a little bit more about, you know, the number of participants in the survey or the number of interviews, just to get a sense of sort of the breadth of the study?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an academic study, and that's important to note here. But basically, we've done about 70, I think it is, a bit more than 70 interviews with authorities in different countries, experts, providers, non-formal, informal, labor market organizations, and employer organizations. And then when it comes to the survey, we had, I think it was about 120 participants who responded, and about 90 providers, if I remember correctly. And I'd say that we can't generalize completely based on this. Of course we can't. We also did some participant interviews to kind of get more in depth. But I think what we found that we're getting such similar responses, regardless of country and background and sort of the types of services, that we felt quite confident that the conclusions we're drawing, at least broadly speaking, that they work. But yeah, it's not an academic study. Ideally, we want loads more participants to answer the survey. We want to have it translated into the 10 most common native languages among countries, but there wasn't really scope for that in the study.